welcome everybody to our first big D3 meetup since the pandemic has hit worldwide. And so my name is Ian Johnson. I'm a co-organizer of the San Francisco Bay Area meetup, which is one of the larger D3 groups. And in years past, we've had many events in person. So I'm really excited that we get to open this up and have such an amazing lineup of speakers for everybody across the world to watch. And as people have put in chat already, folks are tuning in from all over. If you haven't, said hello from where you're at, whether it's across the United States, Europe, South America, India, it's really exciting. So I am going to not talk much longer because we have some amazing speakers, as well as Mike Bostock doing an AMA, and Ask Me Anything, at the end of the meetup. So if you have a question for Mike, there's a Ask a Question function of Crowdcast, and we'll be pulling our questions from there when we do the session at the end. I'd also like to just quickly note that we do have a code of conduct that we follow. We like to keep this a welcoming and inclusive space for everybody. So, please keep that in mind when you're asking questions and chatting in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Melody, the CEO and co-founder of Observable, to say a few words.
Hey, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm Melody. I want to thank everyone for coming today. So at Observable, we are focused on how to explore and visualize data. We want to make it easier for all of us to interact with data and to use it to create, amazing visualizations about the world we live in. And it's not just about creating the visualization, it's about sharing it with the world and collaborating with each other in order to, to learn and to learn from each other and to share with each other. And so at Observable, we're a small team, but we're focused on making more improvements to how we as users analyze the data that are part of our visualizations and help improve the workflows that lead to the creation of the visualization that we're working on. We're also working on tools and components to make it easier to bring pieces of your visualization together. We're adding more examples, we're creating more tutorials around data viz, and investing in community support. So whether that's videos and live streams of folks from the community, or other connections and features that we want to create on the platform, we're here to help and support. But let's talk about D3. There's an announcement this morning, if you haven't seen it, about V6 being launched. I want to say thank you to everyone from the community, yay, that was involved in making that happen. There's some release notes out there that you can take a look at. And on the meetup page, we listed a community survey. So Observable, the company, is committed to investing and working with the community around improvements to D3. That includes, examples, that includes feature improvements. So my request to all of you is when you see that community survey on the meetup page, please tell us what you want to see. Tell us what feedback you have on the product. What examples do you want to see? What feature improvements do you want to be released? We're going to pull together the results of that survey, and we're going to share the summary of that, and then we're going to use that as input for ongoing improvements to D3 in the future. So we'd love to hear from you. I want to say thank you to all the speakers today. Some amazing content we're going to go through, and Mike's going to be available to answer questions that you have. I feel really grateful to have met many members of the community, and I look forward to meeting more of you. So thanks so much for being here, and thank you. Thanks, Ian.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Melody. All right. Well, I am excited to welcome our first speaker. His name is Mike Freeman, and he's an associate teaching professor at the University of Washington Information School. He's done a bunch of great data viz teaching. He's got a lot of stuff online, and he's going to share some of his experience with us right now. So hi, Mike. Welcome.
Hey, Ian. Good to see you virtually.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open another tab and go full screen there. So I won't actually see this chat thread happening here, but I will come back to it at the end. Well, thanks for having me. I am excited to talk about my experience of teaching visualization through the use of the D3 library. Just as a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'll briefly introduce myself so you know who I am. Then I'll talk about how the D3 library allows you to express different design choices as you build visualizations. Highlight some of the challenges associated with that aren't necessarily bad in the ways that D3 challenges you to be more familiar with your data and pay closer attention to detail in the graphics that you're building. And then I'll save a little bit of time at the end of my 15-minute slot here to answer any questions. Please direct any more complex questions to the other Mike Bostock, at the end of this. I don't want to be responsible for those. So as a brief introduction, I am Mike Freeman. I'm an associate teaching professor at the Information School at the University of Washington, predominantly teach in an undergraduate informatics program. The reason that I have been working closely with Observable is that for years I've been teaching an interactive information visualization course to our undergraduates. And just this spring, I transitioned to teaching through Observable. All of those resources are available online. And that was a really great experience that I had this spring. Before that, I was a research fellow and visualization specialist at an organization called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. They do a lot of global health measurement and evaluation work. You've probably seen some of their predictions and evaluations of COVID around the globe. Here's an example of a project that I worked on that was visualizing the way that funding flows through global health. So from different sources, like different countries, through intermediary channels to particular health focus areas. Really what this was about was showing that this is a total mess, that it is really a fairly complex landscape through which all of that money flows. So that's sort of where I learned how to use D3 and build visualization on the web. And now I'm here to talk about what it's like to teach it. So the first thing I want to talk about is how D3 allows you to express different design choices as you're using the library to build those visualizations. Many of you are D3 users, so you know that using D3 is hard. One major reason for that is that you really need to create the universe in which your visualization lives, right? You actually need to construct the spatial context in which you're rendering your different visual elements. So what this provides us is a syntax for expressing our visualization design choices. As an example, here we have, it's called a really simple data set, just the numbers 5 through 25 that are multiples of 5. And if you want to visualize that data, you actually have to explicitly choose which encodings you want. So if you want something that, say, looks like a scatter plot, like we have on the left here, you have to choose what sort of visual mark you want to use, in this case, a circle, and then explicitly assert the relationship between the data that you're using and that visual outcome. So here, you can see the corresponding code to these pieces of visual elements. You can see that in this case, we are increasing the radius according to each one of those pieces of data, right? We could instead just have a constant radius, but if we wanted to actually use our underlying data, we can use that to drive a visual feature. So when you become in charge of that underlying relationship, you're learning more both about the data that you're working with and the visual outcomes that you're producing. Unfortunately, even though we're at D3 v6, I don't think there's any D3.scatterplot. You can't just have this create a scatter plot for you. Or correspondingly, if you want something that looks like a bar chart, like what we have in the middle here, you have to explicitly choose that you want to use a position encoding and render that through a series of rectangles, one for each piece of data. The benefit is that when you control any one of these visual attributes, you can be really careful about that encoding. So all the way to the right, we have some combination of opacity and size, where the font size as well as the opacity of every one of these numbers is rendered here along the side, where that underlying data is mapped to those visual attributes. So you have that really explicit design decision that you're making about how you're positioning your visual elements on the screen. So this example is a little bit fabricated, right? We're just using the numbers 5 through 25. When you actually work with real data, the domain of that data might be very small or very large. And a benefit is that D3 actually pushes you to have a really precise understanding of that data, as well as the drawing space in which you want to render. So as an example, up here, we have visualized, say, your data that maybe ranges from 0 to 10,000. Not sure what that might be about, whatever, sort of continuous data set. And then we have this scale that acts as a function in which you pass that data through your function, and it is rendered in some sort of visual space that we call a range. So you have to, right from the beginning, understand what this relationship is between your data values and then how those get translated to pixels, how 0 in your data space gets translated, say, to 100 in your visual space. And the way that you do that is by passing that data through your scale. Here's sort of an unnecessarily fancy transition in which we could think of these each as a data point that moves through our scale and then renders in our desired visual space. And in doing so, you're really pushing your users to have to understand that data and then how they want to transition that data, how they want to encode it, say, with color, and then where exactly or precisely they want to put that on the screen. These, of course, are challenges that arise for users, but also push people to understand the data better as well as the design process. Something else that D3 does is force really intentional design choices because it doesn't have any underlying defaults for a lot of, say, visual attributes. I wrote a quick tutorial about using color with D3 in visualization. In short, if you have categorical variables, you're trying to use color to distinguish amongst groups. If you have ordinal variables, you're trying to distinguish amongst those and also rank those. So that would be something like good, better, best, or the quality is poor, fair, or good. And actually, if you actually have a continuous variable that ranges, say, from 0 to 100, you're trying to use that color to estimate an underlying numeric value when you're visually decoding that graphic that you're seeing. So in this case, if we, say, are working with some categorical data where we have 3 different categories, and we might choose, just for our own personal preference, to use a red color scheme, we can see down here these 3 red rectangles that allow us to both visually distinguish between them and also rank them. Then we can see one that is more red than an earlier one. And D3 has some nice default color lists made by people who know much more about color theory than I do. And what's wonderful about this is as you come to understand your data and assert how many different categories there are, that actually leads you to the appropriate D3 code that you might want to use to find that list of colors. Similarly, if you have a preference for oranges or greens or blues, then you have a corresponding piece of code that goes along with that. So there's something really powerful here that is happening from the context of teaching and learning, is that we have this interplay between the design and the development that really forces intentionality. So if you've chosen to use D3 to build your visualizations, in a lot of ways, that's going to demand that you understand your data. What type of data is it? What is the range of those different values? But once you've come to do that, that will actually guide you back to the appropriate D3 syntax, right? Once you've come to understand that you have 6 categories in your data, then it's going to help you identify which one of those different, say, lists of arrays of colors you want to use for that visualization. So this surfaces a number of challenges, as you might expect. And the one that those of us who use JavaScript, who use Observable, who use D3, is just that we know that working with data in JavaScript is hard. It can be really challenging. It is not as, let's say, user-friendly as using a different language like R or Python. And I think that even working with a basic data structure is complicated to work with. So as an example, this penguin species data set has been surfacing, and I saw that Ian put up a notebook about it with this cartoon as well. I don't actually know Allison, but this was great, so I wanted to include it. And if we take a quick snapshot of this data, what we've got is a couple of different visual or physical features about each one of these penguins, and then what species it is. So you might be trying to categorize the species based on the bill length or the bill depth or the flipper length. And it's worth acknowledging that even understanding how this fairly familiar 2-dimensional structure is represented when you're working with JavaScript is really a lot of effort for a new user. So that table that we were just looking at, when we translate that to working in JavaScript, is that it's an array of objects. So already there's some vocabulary that I know my mom and dad, hi mom, hi dad, are flinching at here. And then we have that table that might have looked familiar that is now the length of the array is the number of rows. And what were previously sort of familiar column headings are now keys and objects, and the cell values are values that correspond to the keys in the object. This is really a lot to work through as a new user, as I've seen with a lot of my students. A lot of the trouble isn't necessarily with some of the library-specific things. It's actually the data wrangling and data management. And the beginning of that is just understanding the structure of it. So if we wanted to do something fairly simple, like compare the bill length and bill depth of these in a scatter plot, we actually have to make a series of design choices. We have to explore our data, and we have to pay attention to detail, all of which is demanded by using this library, which I actually think is really good for visualization designers. And in my case, I'm working most commonly with students. So we have to make a design choice about the drawing space we're using. We need to explore our data to understand the extent that our data covers. We have to make some real careful attention to detail pieces about where we want to render our axes to communicate about the scales that we're using. And then we have to make design choices about the type of encoding that we're using and that relationship between the data features and the visual features here, the CX and CY attributes of our circles. And then another attention to detail element that is pretty vexing to students is not only putting the appropriate labels on, but deciding where exactly to put them and rotating the text. But even in making this example, I saw this small blue circle pop up in the top left corner. This isn't just a smudge on my screen, but if you were to look into it a bit more, it's that one of these is actually missing some data. So by being forced to use this library in a talk about using the library, I learned more about the data. I became a little bit more responsible for it and gained a higher understanding. Working with Observable this spring, it did solve some issues for me. It, of course, doesn't solve a number of these. It helps you with asynchronous data loading. It helps with automatically re-rendering cells when or charts as your data changes. It does some help in redefining variable scoping in a simpler way for new users. And it also makes code reuse and sharing really powerful. As you can see here, I don't work for Observable, at least not yet. Have had a wonderful experience with them. But this has really, I think, bolstered a lot for the visualization community. And I saved about 2 or 3 minutes for Q&A. I have a couple of links here to the resources that I mentioned, as well as my handle on Twitter and personal website. So I will get out of this notebook and back over to the video. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I am open to any questions. I'm not sure if any of the, oh man, if the moderators have highlighted some questions or if there's anything in particular I should take a look at.
Oh, well, here's one real quick. Timely Portfolio asks, what has been the student response?
That's a great question. Something that's hard about it is that the students don't have the experience of the course with and without using Observable. Right? I imagine the question is particular to using Observable in this class. And sort of I'm the only one who has seen it with and without, that using that tool sort of as the background. What I saw was that it was a lot faster to get started. You could easily import charts from different people. It was easier to get the data loaded. The one thing that students felt a little bit limited by was they didn't quite understand how to translate what they had learned in Observable notebooks out into whatever other websites that they were making. And that was information for me as an instructor that you could, in some pretty short lab sessions, take those skills that are pretty clearly laid out and explain to students how they aren't restrained to the notebook.
Nice.
All right.
Well, let's call out, someone said that the domain range animation was fire, and I concur.
Thank you.
Very nice.
You. I still don't remember the difference every time I say it. Data, domain, visual range, but.
And there's some, I guess, some patterns about, or some questions that are similar around JavaScript experience. And do you introduce D3 first and then JavaScript, or vice versa? And as well as students, what do they struggle with when learning D3? I don't know. There's also some kind of.
So I'll address that general body. So I'm lucky enough to be teaching a group of students who has taken a web development course. So they're familiar with JavaScript, though it might have been 2 years ago, right? It might have been 2 years that they were iterating through arrays or whatever they were doing. So I definitely have a focus right when we restart the course on sort of asserting those fundamentals. But it is a group who has some programming familiarity. It's of course not required for getting started with using some of these tools, but it is super helpful to sort of start out a bit quicker in a 10-week course. In terms of focusing their attention, this is a question from Mutari. It really is about constructing questions or activities that have that directed focus and have them focus on the visual rendering, or have them focus on the working with the data, or have them focus on sort of one new skill set, whether that's having hover tips that show up, or one new different visualization type that they're working with. Jimmy asked, what do they struggle with? A lot of it's the JavaScript, right? A lot of it's the like rendering, iterating through arrays and getting things loaded. And then it is just the volume of details that I think is really overwhelming for people to get started, right? Oh, they have some points up, but they can't get their axes up, and they can't get their titles up, or they want to make a small change to the data. How do they structure their code so that those small changes aren't a series of larger headaches?
Interesting. So hi
yeah.
Shirley. Shirley points out that now there are a bunch of good questions in the Q&A tool. So one that I'll pull out real quick is, what are some aha moments you see that unlock the students' understanding?
Ooh, that's a good one. And also, please cut me off. I want to be sensitive to the general time here for other.
Yeah, I think we got a couple more minutes, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. What are some aha moments? The greatest part about teaching visualization is that it's so satisfying, right? You actually get to see it on the screen. So it's often that stage in the process when they actually see the first time that the data gets appended, even if it's all the circles stacked on top of each other. That's a big moment. Another big moment is when you can get animations and transitions, which is one of maybe the only thing I've found trickier with Observable, because Observable automatically re-renders cells to structure your code so that you can animate those transitions. That has been one challenge that, it's a solvable challenge, but it introduces one more level of complexity in this educational journey. But that's another one, right? It's just, I can't tell you what it is that is so gratifying about making the little points dance, right? It's the same reason that the domain range animation, it's so satisfying, right? If you just have stage transitions, they're really good.
Nice.
Being a little distracted across these, Ian, do you see other things that are popping up that are...
Maybe the last question that I'll call out is, aside from D3, what are the libraries tools you use most often, or maybe use with your students?
Yeah, so it varies by class, and then I guess in my own personal work, but I teach classes that use R and Python and JavaScript. Predominantly the data science courses or the working with data courses revolve around either R or Python. I have a preference towards R. I wrote a book about using R, so I like it, and it's great if more people use it. Also, there's so many free resources, they just look them up on the web. But for the data wrangling pieces and the aggregation and the summaries, using R and Python is awesome. And then when it comes to animated versions, just nothing beats working with D3 and JavaScript.
Nice. All right, so there are some more questions, but maybe we can, there's a couple in the chat and the thing about, education and Observable. And I think I'll just call out that, Mike here is a pioneering user of Observable in a classroom setting and could probably talk for very long about that. And Observable is planning to have at least another meetup around using Observable for education. So if that's a topic that people are interested in, stay tuned, and there'll be more about that.
And if they're super briefly, if there are any educators in the room, reach out to me. All of my content is on Observable, or my classroom syllabus is up there. More than happy to share and collaborate and work with other people, because want other folks to learn.
Awesome. And then before I, let you go and ask for a round of applause, somebody asked about examples of student work. Is that something that you could post in the chat? Or like, do any students publish their stuff?
Yeah, I'll look around and pay attention to the other speakers and try and dig up a couple of things that are notable.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. This is the one downside of not being in person, is that we can't all have a thunderous round of applause that you deserve.
Thank you. I'll imagine.
All right. Well, yeah, so thanks again to Mike Freeman. And I'd like to welcome our next speaker. And oh yeah, people are clapping in the chat. Thank you, folks, for showing love. So I'm really excited to welcome Amelia Wattenberger to speak next. Hi, Amelia.
Hey.
I just want to say that Amelia makes amazing tutorials, blog post visualizations, and I'm sure many of you have already read the Full Stack D3 book that you wrote. So I'm excited to see what you have to share with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for that intro. Thanks, Mike. That was a really great talk. All right. Hi, I'm Amelia. I am historically a web developer. I worked for a long time on analytics dashboards, so I did a lot of the design and development on those. Earlier this year, I switched to an online publication called The Pudding. We do kind of like data-driven articles. You might have seen some of them. They're really fun. I exclusively actually work on the client side. We have an agency called Polygraph, and I'll work on things like making an interactive textbook for a university or creating a data-driven article for like a research institution. So we'll see if I can pull this off, but I decided to split this very short presentation into two parts. The first part, I kind of wanted to talk about the steps that I will use on these client projects. And then the second part will be going over some tips and tricks to kind of keep things nimble when I'm creating charts in D3. So let's dive in. So I've noticed that it's really helpful to have a standard set of steps when you're going through the process of making a data visualization. There are 5 steps in my process proposal. They each start with P. In the D3 naming convention, I've decided to call this the P5 process. Patent pending. So to go through it really briefly, the first step is point. So you want to point yourself in a direction. Then you want to process the data. Next, you go to prototyping some visualizations and iterating on that with feedback. And then you polish it up. And then the last step, of course, is profit, when people start throwing tons of money at you. So let's go into each of these steps in a little bit more depth. So for this first step, point. So I know it's really tempting to jump into the data and jump into the code and just like dig in right away. I know I definitely have that urge, but I always have to stop myself and kind of like figure out what direction we want to go in. Something that I don't find talked about very often is that we actually have something here that we're going to lose very quickly. And I'm going to call it our beginner's mind. And this people talk about this when they talk about education, where if you're teaching someone something really complex, you've been thinking about this concept for a really long time and you know all the terminology around it. You haven't not known it for a really long time. So if you're teaching it to a beginner, you might be using a lot of terminology that you're assuming that they know, or presenting it in a way that's probably pretty confusing. So we can apply this to data visualization, where once you've seen a visualization, you can't unsee it. So it's important to kind of take advantage of that at the start and think through it with that beginner's mind. So the main output of this process step is to answer the question, what is the main goal of this visualization? And I will literally write this down. I will put it at the top of a notebook that I'm working on for a project, and I will refer back to it whenever there's a decision that needs to be made, just to make sure that we're charging off in the correct direction. Okay, moving on. So the second step I'm calling process. So this is when we find the data. We look around, what data do I have access to? Is this data set going to help me answer this question or go towards this goal? Once we have a data set, we'll want to spend a long time with it. I think Mike touched on this a little bit. You really want to become familiar with what metrics are there, sanity check it, make sure this is going to work. What types of metrics are these? Mike talked about, categorical, ordinal, continuous, all these different types of metrics. So just like spend some time with the data set and try to understand what's going on there and figure out if that can help us reach our goal. So I created this process with Observable in mind. I haven't actually gone through this process with Observable, but I definitely will in the future after digging in a little bit more. I've created these exploration stub notebooks that can be forked and used. I've tried to make them really open-ended, and I'm not going to spend much time with this, but please go check it out. I'll share the link afterwards. You basically upload a CSV or JSON file. You can parse it. And then Mike was talking about color scales. So it turns each of the metrics in the data set into either a linear or a categorical color scale. And you can, dive in and see like histograms. And it gets a little bit complicated, but I'm really excited to use this to start digging into data sets for this process step. So once you're more familiar with that data set, it's a good idea to take a pencil and paper and kind of sketch out a few directions that you could see yourself going in. I know I like to jump right into code, but I think there's a lot of freedom you get when you're using pencil and paper. Basically, if you think it, you can draw it. And with code, you kind of get stuck in these ruts of things that are easier to code or things that you've already coded up before. So this is a really important step, at least to me personally. All right, so prototype. This is kind of the main step. I'll spend the most time prototyping. One important thing to remember here is that this is rough. You're making these charts for yourself and you can refactor later. Go ahead and make some messy code. You're probably going to change it later anyways. And I don't think I have time to go into it, but I listed out a few ways that Observable is really helpful here. These are things like making inputs like sliders really easy to embed, or I've created this series of utility functions that I use for manipulating data or drawing charts. Observable makes it really easy. You can search for a chart type and then just grab it and replace the data with your own. And this is another thing I got really excited about, which is you can even pull in other charts within your existing chart. This is something I used in this exploration file, just adding histograms to tooltips, which is something I wouldn't have done in the first place because that seems like a lot of work. But I could actually just pull in a histogram I had already created from another notebook and just throw it in there. So I added this little example to show how you can grab the DOM node from that and just throw it in. And then the second part to this step is getting feedback, which is super important. So once you feel like you're kind of at a stopping point with your prototype, send the link out to people. The key with feedback is you want to get it early and you want to get it often. It becomes harder to kill your darlings, if you've been with them for longer. And then Observable is really nice because you can add comments and then have like comment threads. And then it also has versioning. I'm really excited to try this out within Observable. And then we have this cycle, right? It's repeat. So once you've gotten the feedback, go back to the prototype, Figure out what worked, what didn't work. Maybe you're iterating on it. Maybe you're starting a whole new prototype and going in a different direction. So I will usually iterate on this at least a few times, if not up to 10, maybe even more. And then this last step is the polishing step. So we've decided on the visualization format. We're pretty confident with it. And we want to kind of like polish up the design and get it ready for delivering to the client. So this is a step in which you need to figure out what is the production environment and how do I get there? So this is before you've done all of the design, just in case your production environment, like mine often is within, say, a JavaScript framework or a more complicated website that has technical constraints where maybe you'll have to recode the visualization that you just coded up. Although there are these other options like exporting it as an SVG or using the observable runtime. But even if you have to start from scratch again, I find that it's a lot easier once you've, one, already created the visualization, and two, you know exactly where you're headed. Like you have the design down. So that's the polish step. And then we can move on to profit, you know, share it on Twitter, get the adoration of your fans, whatever you want to do to profit from your visualization, go ahead and do that because it's a job well done. All right, so for the second part, I'm going to go over this really quickly. I basically just wanted to talk about some rules of thumb that I use for that prototype step, this third step here where you're iterating. Like I said, it's the step I spend the most time in. And it's really important to have tight loops. So the more times you go through that loop, prototyping, getting feedback, and iterating on it, probably the better your final output is going to be. So really quickly, so the first rule of thumb that I use is don't do anything more than 3 times. If you're doing something a third time, stop and figure out some way to automate that process or generalize it, turn it into a function. Even if this saves you, only a few minutes, if you've done it 3 times, you're probably going to do it at least 3 more times. So even if you save a few minutes each time, that's saving you a lot of time in the long run. All right, the second rule of thumb is to defer any decisions that come up when you're coding up your visualization. So when possible, make the code flexible. If you're creating a chart and you find yourself wondering what color scheme you should be using or how many bins there should be in a histogram, especially in Observable, it's really easy to just throw in a slider or a toggle so that you can make that decision at a later point. One of the things I really like about data visualization is it's not an exact science. There's not often one correct answer. So a lot of the decisions are kind of more experiential. So being able to defer those decisions and see them with the visualization, I find really useful. And the last rule of thumb is to strike a balance between flexibility and standards and conventions. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but in order to keep your code really flexible, it's really nice to have some conventions that you follow whenever you're creating a chart. So this is a convention you might see if you look at D3 chart code. I think it's sometimes called the margin convention, where you have a wrapper HTML element and then an SVG element. And then I call it bounds, is like the internal rectangle that your data sits in. And this is helpful for allowing space for axes on the left or the bottom or around the chart, and also knowing like how wide your x-axis needs to be. So having that convention is really nice for, looking at old code and knowing how it's going to be set up, or looking at your coworker's code, or, mixing and matching between different charts. And the other convention that I always follow is I have these 7 steps that I go through for any chart that I make. When Mike was talking, it seemed like he also had those steps that he went through. I won't go through them right now. The one that's the most important to me is this access metric step. So in this example down here, I have an x-axis and I have a y-axis, and I know exactly where I'm choosing what variable in my data set that is associated with. So if I maybe want to switch pressure on the x-axis to humidity or cloud cover, I know it's at the top of the file, I know where to change it, and then my chart should update correctly. I know when I was first starting out, I would kind of hard code this pressure key or whatever metric I was using for the x-axis kind of all the way through the chart. And then it would be really, really annoying to update that in the future if I wanted to change even just a small thing. All right, so to wrap up, today I talked about my process for approaching a visualization project, and I also talked about some tips and tricks for keeping D3 chart code flexible. So some key points that I think are important are the beginner's mind. So you only have this at the beginning of a project. Take advantage of it while you can. Feedback, get it early, get it often. Don't get too attached to your visualizations. When prototyping, make your code flexible and save polish until the end. And then in the second part, I talked about some tips for keeping your code flexible. Conventions are super helpful for standardizing both your code and your visualizations. Hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening. Not sure if there's time for questions, but if there is, I'm happy to answer them. And if there isn't, throw them in the chat.
First of all, thanks so much for amazing 2 presentations for the price of 1. So a round of applause, everybody. We have a couple minutes, and I think there's one question that's got a lot of votes that seems particularly interesting, which is, so someone's asking if you're being involved in data viz journalism, what's it like to work on these projects, particularly since news publications move fast and data may be very complicated?
Really good question. Also a question that I have. I've mostly been working on client projects for the pudding, some of which are kind of part of the news cycle, but even the editorial side of the pudding likes to stay away from things in the news cycle. So we keep things a little bit slower paced, but it's definitely more fast paced than like when I was a developer, I would work on a project for months, right? And that doesn't really happen. So it's nice to have projects that wrap up, in a few weeks, and then you can move on to the next one. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Well, I'll add on to that. Do you feel that the process that you outlined in the first part of your talk, are you able to tune it so that you may spend more time or just move faster in some parts of it if need be?
Yeah, definitely. There was this project I did recently, kind of making an interactive textbook for a university, and we spent probably half the time just ideating, talking with them, figuring out how to communicate, because we speak such different languages, like academics talking to, developers or designers. You might say words and they mean different things to everyone. So half of that time was spent in the, I guess it's in the first step, the plan step of just figuring out where do we want to go, just to make sure that you're going to the right place. Cool.
All right. Well, it looks like, there's some links in the chat to check out your work, and so folks can do that. So thank you so much for talking. I also, real quick, I just want to show you, I still have this FPG thing that you made. It's super handy. So actually, I met Amelia at the D3 Unconf last year. Feels like much longer, right? Because time has changed. There we go. Nice.
That's my badge.
Sweet badge. And so I just wanted to try something real quick too with everyone. If because I see so many names in the chat going by of people that I've met at meetups, and that was one of the best parts, right? Of the unconf and meeting up in person, that we all get to know each other. If folks just want to drop a link to like a portfolio, whether it's like your blocks link or Observable username, that kind of stuff, then, you know, when this is all over, people can check each other out and maybe be inspired and stuff. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Amelia. It was great having you speak.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. All right. So now we are going to bring up Mike Bostock and ask him anything. So if you have questions for Mike, please put them in the Ask a Question box, which is where we'll pull these the questions from and go through them.
Hi.
Hey, Mike. Well, so first off, congratulations on launching V6.
Thank you. And thank you to Philippe Riviere, who I see in chat, for all of your assistance with that. It's a huge amount of work.
Yeah. Yeah. How many examples were updated? Something like 400?
450 or so.
450, yeah. Give or take.
Fortunately,
10.
most of them were very small changes. It was just changing D3.5 to D3.6. And there was only sort of a very limited number of sort of more significant changes. But yeah.
Nice, nice. Yeah, so do you want to say a couple more things about V6 before we get into some of these questions? I think I want to give people like a couple seconds to submit a few more.
Sure, yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about V7 in the future as well, because it's like, you know, we've been working on V6 for a while, and it's like, now it's finally done and it's out, and it's like, now I can think about the other stuff. So I linked the release notes in chat, and they're on Twitter. So if you're really interested in the details, like, please go check it out. But kind of in a nutshell, I think the biggest thing is that it's really about modernization. You know, there's a lot of improvements to the JavaScript language since D3 first was created in 2011. And we want to sort of take advantage of those features to make D3 easier to use. So the big one is really JavaScript has native collections now, so like map and set. We don't need to use plain objects for that. And also it has a great sort of iterable protocol where you can have sort of a bunch of different things, not just arrays that you can iterate over. And so together, these give you a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of good sort of new data transformation functions in D3 array, like D3 group and D3 rollup. And those now sort of work harmoniously with D3 selection and D3 hierarchy, and it's really just kind of a joy to use. Sorry if there's like noise in the background. There's like tree trimming that's happening on my street right now. They waited until it was my time to start talking.
Of course, of course.
Can't ask them to leave.
That's how it always goes. So the people want to know what happened to your arm.
Yes, I broke my shoulder skateboarding. So yeah.
Yes, but that hasn't stopped you somehow.
No, fortunately, I can still type with my right hand. I am mousing with my left hand, which is extremely interesting / challenging. But hopefully in 4 to 6 weeks, I'll be back on no sling.
Nice, nice. Well, that answers a couple of the questions. So I'll bring it back to D3 related. The one here with the most votes currently, is it a good idea to learn D3 first without Observable and then add Observable afterwards, or vice versa?
That's an interesting question. I think it depends a little bit on sort of what your objectives are. There's really just so much to learn that you kind of have. You probably would make different decisions a little bit based on what you want to do. Like first, the question is like, do you want to learn D3 versus learning something that's sort of more tailored towards exploratory visualization, like Vega Lite? And then secondly, you know, are you building kind of a bespoke web application? Are you doing sort of more exploratory data visualization and analysis? Are you just having fun and doing experiments? Kind of like all of those things would influence sort of what I would recommend as to like which tools you should start to learn. But certainly, like, you know, Observable is intended to be kind of the best environment for not just learning D3, but for learning JavaScript, for learning programming, for learning web standards, for learning any sort of library, because it has this environment where, using data flow, it's really easy to tinker with the code, to not break the code in the process of tinkering with it, and to get very quick feedback, and also to see what everybody else is doing. And I think it's really that the community, seeing the work that other people are doing, being able to learn from it, and being able to sort of adapt it into your own work is what makes Observable so powerful.
Nice. And I guess that reminds me of, well, I see another question, which reminds me of something you told me. So the question is, where do you draw creative inspiration from? And the thing that I just want to quickly say is that, you've made a lot of examples, right? And you told me before about how many of them are actually inspired by answering people's questions in the community. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what creativity is. Creativity doesn't come from inside, right? Like creativity is kind of the environment that you're in, and your ability to synthesize it in interesting ways, like seeing hey, there's an interesting technique here, there's an interesting technique here. What happens if I combine those two things? So I think it's watching what's going on, sort of constantly consuming stuff and being aware of the work that's going on around you and talking to other interesting people. I mean, certainly back when I was working in the New York Times graphics department, I mean, that was the best possible place to be seeing all of this creative work that other people are doing. But I mean, thanks to the internet, you can see a lot of that other stuff going on. And of course, a lot of interesting work's happening on Observable as well. So, I think it's just being on the lookout and trying to constantly not just sort of see what other people are doing, but also to try to learn how that works, and to try to kind of dissect it and sort of recreate it for yourself. Because part of creativity is first sort of being exposed to new ideas, but then also is sort of like I said, the ability to synthesize it, which means that you've kind of learned how it works, you kind of understand the underlying idea, and then you can put it back together in interesting new ways. But yeah, I think your point about the questions and user support is also really interesting. I mean, that's, I would guess, how the majority of improvements to D3 really get made, right? They don't come from a vacuum where it's I have an idea of here's something that we should do. It's somebody is saying, I tried to do this and it was really hard, or it didn't work, or there's nothing in D3 that really helps me do this, or how do I do that? And so you just get in a habit of answering those questions. And if you see the same question or the same type of question sort of a couple times, like Amelia said, it's well, let's maybe make this a feature. And that way it's automated and it's available for other people to use as well.
Awesome. Well, I guess a question that is popping up again in the chat and in the Q&A is, if you created D3 again, would you change anything about it that you can't change now? Or I've also heard people say, if you just started over right now, would you do something different? Or
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a related question, which is what do I think are kind of the common misunderstandings of D3, and maybe how could I address that? I think, so one of the things that we're trying to do a better job going forward in how we communicate what D3 is this sense of D3 as really kind of a suite of loosely coupled tools rather than a framework or a monolithic library. So a lot of times people really focus on the data join and selections as part of D3. And that certainly is an important component of D3. And arguably, when D3 first came out in 2011, that was kind of the main insight or the main contribution of D3. But I think now, having seen sort of all of the other components and all of the sort of creative ways that people are using D3, where they're not necessarily using D3 selection, they're using another DOM framework, like React, like Svelte, like Vue, like Angular, or they're using Observable. There's a lot of different ways that you can still use many of those other primitives of D3, like scales and shapes and color schemes and interpolators, without using data joins and selections. So I think first I'd like to have sort of a clearer description or positioning of D3 as this sort of suite of components that people can pick and choose what they want to learn. This concept of a standard library for visualization, and you can sort of pick whichever part you're interested in learning first. You don't kind of have to learn everything in order to start making progress. There's some other things, but it's not like I have regrets on wanting to go back and change how D3 works. But related to sort of the modernization of the JavaScript language and browsers, I think certain, like I've been thinking about like D3 scale. Could that be made sort of more immutable? Same thing with D3 hierarchy. Are there other things like maybe changing the abstraction of scales a little bit? So scales are fairly monolithic in the sense that, so it makes them very convenient to use. But for example, you can set the range of a scale to be, numbers, it can be color names, it can be arbitrary objects. And so you have D3 interpolate, and D3 interpolate does all of this type inference and then sort of dispatches out to a bunch of different interpolators. And I wonder if there's sort of a way to decouple that a little bit more so that it can be, you don't have to pull in like, D3 time code if you're just using a linear scale, for instance. And then similarly, sometimes people want various mathematical transforms that they apply to the scale. And so you have like D3 scale log, D3 scale pow, or D3 scale square root. And I think there might be an opportunity to decouple those things as well. So both small ideas or small-ish ideas and sort of, I think communicating how people should think about D3 is something I'd like to do better. Nice.
And I guess this question almost works as a follow-up at this point. So somebody's asking about, I guess I'll summarize it as sort of the future governance of D3 as an open source project or as a thing, right? Like if you were to retire or, go skateboarding again, what should people, like, how do you see that, right?
I mean, so I think there's a couple things there. I mean, first is like, it's totally open source, so people can go do whatever they want with it. Like, I don't really have control over what you do with D3, even if I wanted to. Like, you can do whatever you want with it, and you're more than welcome to do so. But I think the second thing is, I think one of D3's strengths is sometimes we say that D3 isn't opinionated, like Mike Freeman was talking about, where it sort of forces you to make intentional decisions about, like, what type of data do you have, what type of encoding, visual encoding do you want to use. But on the other hand, like, D3 does have a particular style, and it is very much designed to sort of work together. So it is loosely coupled. You don't have to use everything together, but we also try to stylistically sort of make it consistent so that if you've learned kind of one concept in one part of D3, that extends to another part of D3, and it's not like two wildly different paradigms. And I think some of that comes, from having a small number of people or me that's like really trying to think hard about what our style is, because it's very hard to articulate those rules. It's just sort of a sense of like whether this thing kind of works together. You just kind of look at it and get a sense for that. So I think it is helpful to have that kind of stylistic opinion in terms of making something that's cohesive and that's easier to approach. And at the same time, it is very loosely coupled. And by that, it means that people can extend it and write new plugins and do all sorts of other stuff. So a lot of the community contributions have been in these other types of modules that, again, sort of work harmoniously with the other parts of D3, but they aren't, managed by me. Other people maintain them. And then similarly, sort of the examples and tutorials, like, I think that's by far the most active part of the community. It's not necessarily coming up with new libraries, although people do that, or new modules, but it's really all of the activity around tutorials and examples that people share as well, which is a large part of how people learn D3 and even how they use D3, right? Like, a lot of people aren't creating new visualizations from scratch, either by having completely internalized and being fluent with the D3 API, or by just, reading the API reference and then writing something from scratch, right? Like, I would guess that more than 90% of the time, people are looking at some of those other examples and using that as their starting point for exploration. So that already, I think, is very distributed, and it's great to see all the activity in the community there of people sharing examples and books even, Amelia.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that's actually a perfect segue to shout out the survey that we put on the meetup page, because it'd be great, yeah, if we had data to better understand all the ways that people learn and use D3, right? We're at time. There's two questions that I wonder if you have 3 minutes. That one is a technical one, so it's about TypeScript. I don't know if you have a answer around D3 and TypeScript and observable in TypeScript that you would like to share.
Sure. TypeScript is great. That's my short answer. But like for D3, I think the challenge is, like, I don't maintain the types for TypeScript. And I'm just kind of being triaging there, right? Like I've got a limited amount of time, and I don't personally use TypeScript, at least not yet. I may start using it in the near future. And so I just haven't taken on the responsibility of maintaining those types, and instead have relied on these other projects like Definitely Typed in order to maintain the types. I think if I were maybe using TypeScript myself, then I would be more inclined to sort of maintain that. But right now, it's just kind of an additional burden, and it's not my focus. For Observable, that's another sort of interesting question of letting people use TypeScript within notebooks. And I think we could look at doing that. The challenge, though, I think is, there is an advantage to having a single language. So another thing people often ask us is like, can I write Python in Observable notebooks? And that one's a little bit easier to answer because, Observable runs in the client, it runs in the browser. It's therefore heavily biased towards using the browser's native language of JavaScript. Although there are now sort of with WebAssembly, a lot of other interesting opportunities to sort of transpile or use WebAssembly to run non-JavaScript languages in the browser. TypeScript is sort of not really another language, right? I mean, it is another language, but it essentially like compiles to JavaScript, and therefore it's much more accessible for us to do that in the browser. So I think we may do that. But I do worry a little bit about sort of interoperability and consistency. Like having a single language makes it a little bit easier for people to sort of look at the code and it looks like all the other code that they see on Observable rather than being different language. The flip side, though, is that like TypeScript, for a variety of reasons, is just maybe easier to learn and certainly like easier to develop at scale because of the type safety. So I think something like better inline documentation that sort of lets you, that shows you sort of the arguments that you can pass to a function, that sort of feature that you get in other editors, that's really compelling. And I think that might be enough of a reason for us to want to have TypeScript in there in Observable in the future, because it's really about making it more discoverable, making it easier for people to learn.
Excellent. All right. The other question that I wanted to ask, but we're really out of time, so maybe I'll modify it a little bit, is because they were asking, they'd love to hear about your experience, making data viz at the New York Times. You alluded to that being like, fast-paced, a great place to get a lot of creative input. But maybe you could, is there a visualization you worked on that comes to mind that was either, particularly interesting to make, or that you're really proud of that we could, put in the chat? And
my favorite visualization probably that I worked for the New York Times was the 512 Paths to the White House, which was back in Obama's reelection. And it was basically looking at sort of all of the different ways that the electoral votes can be allocated. And, if you assume that you have sort of a limited set of swing states and you're not looking at all sort of 50 states, then you actually have sort of a semi-reasonable graph that you can understand. Like if this happens, then this happens, So if I think it was Romney, right? Like if Romney wins Florida, then Obama has to win like all of these other things in order to get elected. And the thing that was most exciting about that for me was that it felt like it kind of changed the discourse a little bit about how people talked about what's going to happen with the election, right? Because very often the newscasters would talk about like a single scenario with the idea that it's sort of as likely as everything else. And I think one of the advantages of visualization is that it gives you this macro view, where you're not just talking about one possible scenario. You're kind of looking at the whole landscape of scenarios and getting a sense of sort of the relative likelihood of each of those two different things. And so having had that visualization, it was kind of, emotionally reassuring as to what was going to happen. Not necessarily true of the following election, however, with the different visualizations and the needle. But anyway.
Great. All right. Well,
it also had cool animations in it, which
absolutely. And people have posted the link in the chat, so anyone who hasn't seen it can definitely check it out. So thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions. It feels like this may be something we could do again sometime, since there's definitely questions we didn't get to. And yeah, so thank you.
Thanks, y'all, for the questions.
Yeah, and to just the last thing I'll share, the chat is going to be captured and we'll share it back out. There's been an amazing discussion in the community here. It'll be a great way to find interesting work folks are sharing with each other. I'll plug the survey one more time. Please take that. Y'all are the people that are here for D3, and the survey is to better serve all of you. And the aggregated de-anonymized results will be shared with the community because obviously y'all are exactly the folks that could visualize and help understand ourselves, right? And someone did mention my shirt being the quick draw data. It is in fact a shirt of the quick draw data. So thank you for noticing. All right, so thank you all for attending. This is an awesome meetup. It was great to have folks from all over the world tune in and take part of this conversation. We'll definitely be doing this again before too long. Thank you to Observable for essentially hosting, providing the venue for this, and helping pull it all together. And yeah, so thank you. I'll see you online.